This is TAU Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Please welcome your host, Ido Aharoni, Tel Aviv University's graduate, member of the Board of Governors, lecturer, writer, and veteran diplomat.
Welcome to another episode of TAU Unbound. I'm Ido Aharoni, your host, and it is my great pleasure and privilege to host in our studio Professor Leiderman.
That's right. Thank you.
I pronounce your name correctly.
Yes.
But your name appears many times in the Israeli media over the years. So I'm happy that I managed to pronounce it correctly. Professor Leiderman, before we begin, let me just tell our audience who you are. Many of us do know you here. So Professor Leiderman is a leading economist in Israel with an incredible career. He's a professor emeritus of economy at the Berglas School of Economics at Tel Aviv University. He's also teaching at the Coller School of Management. He used to teach also in Abu Dhabi. He rose to academic tenure very quickly here at Tel Aviv University, but more importantly is his role as a leading decision maker on the Israeli economy, both in his capacity with the Bank of Israel, the Central Bank of Israel, and also as an economist for major financial entities like Deutsche Bank, Hapoalim, and others. So it's such an incredible pleasure to host you here.
The pleasure is all mine, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, and we always like to begin with the personal stuff, right? So you were born in Cordoba, Argentina.
That's right.
And so you came to Israel later in life. Tell us about that experience. It's always fascinating to hear the personal story of someone that came from other countries to Israel.
Well, the personal story is one of a young person that studied at a Hebrew school, at a Jewish school in the Keilah, in the community in Cordoba, Argentina. Cordoba is the second largest city in Argentina, an industrial city.
But you studied Hebrew as a kid.
Yes, we studied every day 3 hours of Hebrew, and then the ordinary stuff that everyone in every school studies in Argentina. And from an early age, we went to the TNUA, to the Zionist movement, to the Boy Scouts, we call it that way, what we call in Israel the Tzofim, and we were very much identified with the state of Israel. Then came the Six-Day War in 1967. I was then 2 years before the end of my secondary school, and that gave another push to the Zionist views. And we saw friends and family that came to Israel as volunteers, writing to us letters from a kibbutz and from many other places. What does it mean to be a volunteer, and so on and so forth. So there was no doubt in my mind that at the end of high school I will want to come to Israel, and I went to the Sheliach, and I was lucky to be accepted at Hebrew University of Jerusalem to study for my BA, for my undergraduate studies. At that time, of course, and even nowadays, when you are a new immigrant, the army postpones the obligatory service here in Israel. So therefore, I had an interval of time in which I could study, and Ido, I can tell you one thing about all this. It was an exciting time. It was a very exciting time. You could feel the vibrant nature of the Israeli society, of studying at a leading university, at a leading department, the Department of Economics at Hebrew. And it was my time as a student before I moved on to Chicago in 1974. Was a great time.
So you moved to Israel right between the Six-Day War and the 73 War, which was a period of great growth in Israel, right? It was great euphoria, which ended with 73, but you were here at the yes. most energetic period.
And you know what? I remember myself as a child, let's say early 20s. I'm standing in Jaffa Street of Jerusalem, in the center of Jerusalem, waiting for the bus. And wonderful weather. And I say to myself, how could it be so perfect? how could it be, how everything, and it relates very much to your word of euphoria, because everything looked quite wonderful. And this is the place where, at the start of our conversation, I would like to emphasize my prayer and my prayers for the hostages, the people that are now our people in Gaza, and the identification with the families of the victims of this terrible war. I think we should all also thank our brave soldiers, including those on the reserve, because it is because of them that we have the privilege to sit here quietly at Tel Aviv University in our wonderful campus and have this conversation.
From your mouth to God's ears. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. This is very meaningful. And so you made the transition from Argentina to Israel in the early 70s, late 60s, studied economics at the Hebrew U. Then you found yourself in the United States, studied in the most lucrative department perhaps in the whole world, right? In Chicago.
Well, it's one of the top five.
One of the top five. And your academic interest begins to focus on the issue of inflation and disinflation. So tell us what it means. What does it mean?
First of all, I must say that I was very lucky. I was lucky to come to Chicago at a time that was maybe one of the maximal points in its academic value. It is still a great university. Number two, I did my PhD thesis with someone that got the Nobel Prize thereafter. And even in his speech at the Nobel Academy accepting the prize, there is a footnote to my work with him. It was a great honor. Professor Robert E. Lucas, Jr. He is responsible for something that is called in academia, in my area, the Lucas Revolution, or the rational expectations revolution. So my interest, Ido, was and is in macroeconomics. It means growth, interest rates, exchange rates, inflation, disinflation, unemployment, financial markets. This is my interest. And quite early in the game, I focused my research on the empirical side. I'm not a theoretical economist. I'm an empirical economist that takes some theories, makes some adaptations to reality, hopefully, and then looks at the data to try to, to see whether the data are compatible with the predictions of the models. And it is in this context that once I came back to Israel after my doctorate, I started working more and more on inflation, because I started at Tel Aviv University in 1979, and already in the early 80s, we see the escalation of inflation. Of course, our viewers know what it means, inflation, the rate of increase in the consumer price index, okay? And of course, we want, as consumers, we want inflation to be as low as possible, so that our salaries are worth more and more when we go to the supermarket or to other places. So 1979 is a time in which there is an escalation of inflation.
And what were the reasons for it?
The main reasons, Ido, were I should say very clearly, a mismanagement of macroeconomic policy after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. After the Yom Kippur War, there is a need to increase government spending and government defense spending. And there is always a question, like there is nowadays. How do you finance that? And we also got some financial aid from the United States, and we have to take that into account. But the government went into major deficits, and at that time, it was completely legal for the central bank, the Bank of Israel, to print money, just to print
with no consideration
shekels.
Of what it means.
No, well, maybe considerations, but the view was that sort of the central bank is kind of unified with the political side and with the treasury. it was
So the central bank, in other words, could have been an arm of partisan politics.
in some sense, yes. And it is only later that
There's a wall between the...
Exactly. It is only later that the Bank of Israel, by law, became autonomous and independent. What does it mean, independent? That it can get no directives from the political side. There is no such thing like the prime minister or the finance minister picking up the phone, calling the Bank of Israel governor and telling him or her, we need money, please deposit bills, lirot or shekel bills in the bank.
Which is what you say they did after 73.
Exactly. So there was a lot of money printing and there was a lot of deficit. And you know what? In the history of inflations, the most famous inflation is the German hyperinflation of 1923. Okay, with an inflation rate of more than 20,000% per year. Can you imagine that? 20,000% per year. There are many, many stories. Germany was defeated in World War I. That war ended in 1918. Germany had to recover, and big deficits, big money printing, big inflation. And this is the very famous German hyperinflation. Now, it turns out that precisely at the time that inflation was escalating in Israel in the late 70s and early 80s, the same was happening in Latin America. So whether you looked at Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Argentina, very interesting. And also in those places, the central banks were not independent. So it was perfectly okay legally that the central bank print money in order to finance the government budget deficit. And so one of the most fascinating things that happened to me is that I sort of started doing a lot of comparative studies. And for example, I'm sure you know, and some of the viewers know, that in Israel, when inflation went up, we developed the concept of indexation, so that our salaries became indexed to the consumer price index. Because inflation was going up, you needed to protect the people. And so the Histadrut and the government and the industrialists and so on got some agreements about that. Then our financial assets became indexed to some degree, like government bonds and so on and so forth. And, at the same time in Brazil, there was the phenomenon of indexation. So one of the things I remember was a very good conference we had here in our campus with policymakers coming from Brazil and trying to learn, all of us, from this comparative.
Now, would you say that what happened in the world during the pandemic was similar? Where governments were pouring money into the economy, especially in the United States, which I don't know if that had anything to do with the fact that inflation all of a sudden became an issue. And again, especially in the United States, but not only.
Well, I guess it's a different type of a shock. COVID-19 was what we call a shock from the supply side of the system, okay? In other words, here you have a pandemic, and there is no choice but to close the shops, to close the companies, to close the manufacturing lines, etc., etc. So there is not enough output. At the same time, it is a demand shock, because they tell us, please don't go a given distance from your home, at least at the beginning. We had all the lockdowns, okay? And so there was some kind of a paralysis of economic activity, but that happened early on in the game, okay? Especially the second quarter of 2020. From then on, the arrival of vaccination and the measures taken by government and so on and so forth, that you're completely right. The governments all over the world, and especially in Israel, said to themselves, look, this is we hope this is a temporary thing, that sooner or later we are going to overcome this pandemic. So we don't want businesses to fail down. We don't want businesses or companies to default because of something that pretty soon we are going to recover from it. And therefore, I think that it was very justified, all this injection of money and some all kind of indemnizations for people not earning enough. The acceleration in inflation, of course, completely different from the 1980s, came more towards the end of 2021. Well, first of all, with the pandemic, of course, there was something that we economists didn't study enough before, and it is a great disruption in what's called the global supply chain. Okay, when I was teaching my students here in Tel Aviv about the automobile industry, I was saying an automobile is an automobile, but an automobile is the wheels may be coming from Poland, and maybe the windshield is coming from Brazil, and the semiconductors are coming from Taiwan. And when you have the pandemic and you have a freeze in international trade, all of a sudden you find a phenomenon that some companies have to close down because they don't have the components. The most clear example is and was the automobile industry in Germany. You had the major companies like Volkswagen, Mercedes, and others that had to close down because they didn't have the components. And therefore, with the scarcity of that, prices started going up. Then came the invasion of Putin to the Ukraine in February of 2022. And then the world faces, again, scarcity of a lack of oil, a lack of natural gas, and so on. And then prices go up. And this is how we meet, at the end of 2022, inflation rates of about 8%.
Now, you were in the room back in the 1990s when your team was able to bring down inflation in Israel. From 2-digit to 1-digit level inflation, which was considered to be an achievement, a world-class achievement. How did you do it?
Well, first of all, a word of modesty. I was only a player, another player in a team. The leader was Professor Jacob Frenkel, who was then the governor, and then there was Mr. David Klein. He was the head of the monetary department.
And we should mention that Jacob Frenkel also was the chairman of the board at Tel Aviv U for many years, a professor right. Here, also in Chicago, and now he's my colleague at Value Base.
That's right, and I have a long history of collaboration with Professor Frenkel. We had, as I said, Mr. David Klein. I was the head of research. David Klein was the head of the monetary department, and also there was Dr. Meir Sokoler, who was the deputy of the monetary department. I think we were the sort of the leading team of the effort, and you know what? It's like the textbook. It's like the textbook. We had to first of all advocate for more fiscal discipline, more discipline in the budget by the government. And in the early 90s, the government was not that disciplined in terms of the budget deficit. And secondly, it is very difficult to reduce inflation without a monetary contraction, without raising interest rates and reducing liquidity in the system. I think it is I'm not one of the famous Chicago boys, but one of the most important legacies of Milton Friedman was to emphasize the crucial role of monetary policy, the policy that affects liquidity, the policy that affects interest rates, and therefore we had no choice but to raise interest rates and to reduce liquidity in the system, something that is very painful. Very painful. It's like taking a medication that sometimes the short-term side effects are quite painful, but you have to believe that in the medium term, your conditions are going to improve tremendously. This is one of the stories of monetary policy, and we were very determined.
Now, let me ask you a question about what's happening in the United States, because I think they're still very much concerned with inflation. And so we have Donald Trump becoming the 47th president of the United States very soon, and he was also the 45th president of the United States. So what do you think is going to happen in the United States? And if you were in the shoes of his main advisor on macroeconomy, what would your advice be to him?
Well, Ido, this is the 10 or $100 billion question this morning and nowadays. We don't know. We don't know because we can think that there could be the good Trump from the point of view of the economy, what we think, the point of view of the economy, and the bad Trump. What is the bad Trump? The bad Trump would be one that right from the beginning raises at a very high rate the custom duties, the tariffs for imports of the U.S. from China.
If you can say a word about tariffs, because a lot of people think that tariffs is something that the foreign governments are paying.
Well, this is what Donald Trump is thinking, right? So, as we know, tariff is a tax on imports. So, if I want to buy a cosmetic product in Israel and there is a tariff, of course, the price of the product on the shelves here in the pharmacy or the drugstore in Israel is going to be the price abroad, plus transportation costs, etc., plus any taxes, plus the tariff. Of course, the tariff raises the price. The first and foremost person that is paying the tariff is the consumer. Now, there could be, and this is the case in the United States, there could be also imports of raw materials. So to the extent that the auto industry in Detroit is importing in order to produce all kind of U.S.-made automobiles, things from China, and they depend on the imports of components from China, of course, the companies are going to feel that costs have risen, and what is going to happen is that the price of automobiles is going to go up. So in the old days, there was a school of thought under some conditions that said that when you impose a tariff, you are protecting the domestic industry. So the fact that the cosmetic product I was mentioning before becomes now more expensive to us will lead you and me and our families to buy less of the imported cosmetic product and more of a domestically made cosmetic product. This was in the old days that there was less globalization, but nowadays it is your interest and my interest to buy the cheapest product, and then this will leave to you and to me more income to spend on other things, in going to the movies or to restaurants that are domestic things. So you have to look at the picture as a whole. The fear is that if Donald Trump goes very harsh on China, China is going to respond. China is going to raise tariffs on U.S. import on exports from the U.S. imports to China. This could lead to what's known as a trade war. Okay, the most famous trade war that was a dismal phenomenon was in the early 1930s, when we know that the largest crisis, macro crisis, was the 1929 Great Depression in the United States. Then this came to Europe, etc., etc. But going back to your question, yes.
And by the way, many people have the misperception that it's only the United States that is importing goods from China. They don't realize how big is the American export to China.
Exactly. You are completely right. Lots of American exports, including chicken and other things from the U.S.
And corn.
And corn. and I can tell you one thing. The experience is very clear. Everybody suffers from a trade war. If there is a trade war, okay, if Trump imposes a tariff on China and China does not retaliate, maybe there is a feeling that in the short term, the U.S. may gain in this dual game. Once China reacts, it can be proven in this very simple economics that international trade will come down, everybody will feel worse off, and so, it's something that it doesn't have any sense.
And the same thing applies to Canada and Mexico in terms of
Canada, Mexico, and also Europe. The Europeans are very, very anxious and are very fearful that Trump may impose tariffs on them. And we have to emphasize one thing, that the Europeans are the main trading partner of China. And China is the main trading partner of the Europeans. So they are already positioning for a situation in which maybe both mentioned areas are going to be reducing their trade with the United States, but increasing the trade among them. So the bad Trump is this. The bad Trump goes tough on legal immigration. Okay, I'm not talking about illegal immigration. Legal immigration. The U.S. is in need of workers, and not only the skilled ones, not only the very advanced engineers, but also from all other professions. And to the extent that Trump goes very, very harsh on the import of workers from abroad, wages in the United States, salaries are going to go up quite dramatically. And so we may get inflation coming from tariffs, we may get inflation coming from this phenomenon, and we may get inflation coming from the budget, because the United States is facing a very high budget deficit, and more importantly, a very high ratio of debt to GDP. That is the result of deficits in many, many years. So this is the bad Trump. The good Trump will be one that promotes research and development, that reduces bureaucracy, that improves efficiency in the private sector, that goes to some infrastructure. Everybody visiting the U.S. sees the state of the streets and the bridges and so on. There is a lot of need of doing infrastructure work there.
Which in turn would reinvigorate the economy.
Exactly. And let's put it very clearly, Trump is getting a major gift from Biden or from the private sector. The U.S. economy as of now is in very, very good shape. At the beginning of 2024, the debate was whether the U.S. economy will face a soft landing or a hard landing in the level of economic activity. Well, Ido, there was no landing at all. 2024 ended with a growth rate close to 3% per year, which is magnificent compared to Europe or to other countries.
So as an economist, you're also an expert on society. So that your description, brings a very interesting question. So in terms of the parameters for the economists, the United States economy was in great shape. But what would the sociologist or the anthropologist would say when people are complaining about not only the cost of products in the supermarket, but also, how much money they spend on insuring their car? That many people claim that they pay more for the insurance than they actually pay for the car.
Yes. Well, I think we are living in a period in which there is a universal phenomenon. And the universal phenomenon is that the middle class feels quite oppressed. The middle class, unfortunately, has not been the main beneficiary of the globalization that we saw in the last 2 or 3 decades. Okay? And as a result, so let's put it very clearly. Let's take a couple. She works at Tel Aviv University as an administrator. He works as a bank teller in a bank. They have 3 kids. Their incomes, their real incomes, have not changed that dramatically over the last decade or 2 decades. And True, the cost of travel has gone down, so you have now cheap flights. Not exactly now, but you have low-cost things that didn't exist before. But in general, I think we feel that there is an increase in the income inequality, the inequality in income distribution and wealth distribution. And as a result of that, once again, the middle class feels under a lot of pressure. And this has been a very fertile territory on the political side for populism. And so when Boris Johnson gets elected in England, and he enacts the famous Brexit, takes England out of Britain out of the European Union, something that nobody could have imagined, okay? Something that economists all over the place, including at the Bank of England, were criticizing, where they were saying we are going to lose rather than gain from that.
And yet they did it.
They did it, and they did it with a referendum, a popular vote. I remember going to sleep at night thinking, well, it's going to be rejected. And the following morning, I was in the trading floor of Bank Hapoalim because, as you can imagine, the British pound was falling down, and people were saying, well,
Are there any serious economists in England or Europe that think it was a good thing?
I don't know. There may be someone there, but clearly it was a lot of populism saying, well, we move out of the European Union and therefore there will be more jobs for us here. And then you have Donald Trump, the first term of Donald Trump, when Donald Trump, the first sentence that he says, America first. He doesn't say we are going to be the leaders of democracy, freedom, human rights in the whole world. He said, America first. This is what I want. And if it takes building a wall in the frontier with Mexico, we will do it, and so on. So again, Trump was selling to the people in the Midwest the idea that the Chinese workers or that the Chinese imports are those responsible for unemployment in Detroit and the auto industry. Well, it was completely fake because economic research shows that the main reason for a decline in employment, whatever there was a decline in employment in the auto industry, was automation, robotization. It was technology. It was the technology revolution that was doing that. And so, to come back to your question, I think that we see all over the world manifestations of a lack of tranquility, some sort of a disappointment, a frustration. This is the word I was looking for. Frustration by the middle class. And of course, the big benefits went to the financial sectors. Wall Street moved very nicely with the globalization, the high-tech industry, of course, and so on and so forth.
Now, in Israel, we are in the midst of a major event, unlike any other event in the short life of our country, which is a multi-front military effort, first in Gaza, in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran. And we're being told that the government spending is very, very significant, right? Dramatically significant. What do you think is going to be the impact of that? Because some people say this is a generational effort to overcome the deficit.
Well, I think that first of all, some increase in the deficit is unavoidable because of the increase in government spending on defense. Israel needs to prepare for a new sort of geopolitical reality. And we saw in this war things that we never saw before, like an attack from Yemen by the Houthim, the whole advance in the war of missiles, not a war of troops that are, of course, troops also, but the technology is changing and has changed, and we need to defend ourselves. So it all begins there. And clearly there is a need to prioritize, because it is quite clear that the defense industry and the defense ministry and the military may come with programs that are unlimited. And of course, one has to put a limit, because every shekel that goes to the military does not go to education or to poverty or to welfare. And we have to do some kind of optimization. I think what worries many economists like myself and many colleagues here at Tel Aviv and other universities is the fact that besides government defense spending, we have seen an increase in other items of government spending that are not the ones that are contributing most to prepare Israel for a recovery, for an economic and social recovery once we can do that after the war or when things become to be stabilized. An example is what's called in the Israeli media the coalition money. As you know, we have a coalition that is not a very strong one. And there are all kinds of pressures on government, whether it is some of the religious lobbies, some of the other lobbies, and so on and so forth. And also here, one has to optimize. But I think that one should have expected that at least some of that additional money be postponed. I'm not saying be eliminated, because I don't want to be completely utopic, to live in utopia, idealistic. But okay, fine, there is a coalition, it needs to serve its interest, it happens everywhere in the world. But at this moment, I think many people in Israel, including economists, we were expecting that instead of having 30 plus ministries, that there will be some consolidation and that some ministries will be consolidated and reduce the spending. And this so far did not happen. So from that point of view, we are in the middle of the budget discussions for 2025. The Knesset the parliament has to discuss more and more, and the sort of constraint is that the 2025 budget has to be approved before the end of March. Okay, so they have almost 3 months, because if there is no approval of the budget at the end of March, the government fails, and we have to go to general elections. I don't think that this is going to happen, and they are going to find some compromise over there. But we have the risk of having a permanent rise in government spending on defense for many, many years. That is a true need of the country. And this will mean a lot of sacrifice by the people, whether it is due to increased taxes or reduced spending on other items. And we want to see the government participating in that sacrifice in the forms that we discussed before.
Which reminds me a lot of what happened in the 1980s with the first Lebanon War, and what happened as a result of the war, and the efforts to stabilize the economy.
Right, except that here, this is probably the worst war that we had in history. First of all, in terms of the length, we used to have short wars, and here it's continuous. It goes on with this type of intensity or another type of intensity, and so on and so forth. And we have many fronts in this war. Lebanon was Lebanon. Here we have all these complex things, and at the end of the day, there is the problem of Iran. Iran is behind many of the developments here. On the other hand, trying to be a bit optimistic, I think that we have here a window of opportunity to have a new positioning of Israel within the geopolitical structure of the Middle East. Because if out of this we come with a stronger ties with the United States, maybe with Europe, if Saudi Arabia agrees to normalize more and more relations with us, and so on and so forth, this could be something. We saw the default or the fallout of the Assad regime in Syria. I mean, there are so many things that are changing here. we have a window of opportunity, and the question is whether we will be able to take advantage of that.
Well, let's hope that we will. And Professor Leiderman, I want to thank you for taking the time to come and teach us so much about macroeconomy, about inflation, about budget deficit, and so on. It was a pleasure to have you.
It was my pleasure, and again, let's hope that our next conversation will be about different avenues for recovery from Israeli economy and society.
Yeah, we didn't get a chance to discuss growth. We will talk about growth in our next conversation. And from Tel Aviv to our viewers at home, goodbye until our next episode.